Hi, wonderful students. I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving holiday. Um, I know, as promised, I am recording a lecture today, so you guys can really just focus on turning in any assignments that are maybe past due, that you're catching up on if you missed a class or your last exam and things like that. And then you will receive extra credit for reviewing this lecture and completing a short quiz, which will be available on Blackboard. So today what we're going to be talking about is we'll be exploring cognitive behavioral therapy, and I'll discuss how thoughts, emotions, and behaviors interact to influence one's mental health. And we'll look at some key interventions and case examples of cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, so first let's just get a feel for the historical background of cognitive behavioral therapy. So the cognitive revolution really started in the mid 20th century with a paradigm shift from psychoanalytic theories, which we talked about in previous lectures, to move more towards empirical methods such as cognitive behavioral therapy. And this model really hones in on scientific foundations, um, such as using measurable therapy models that are really grounded in research, which wasn't always the case, as we know. And so some key pioneers include Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, and those are the two primary uh, pioneers of CBT, and we'll be talking about both of them today. Okay, so let's start off with talking about Albert Ellis and his early development and his really dissatisfaction with therapeutic models of the time, such as psychoanalysis. So he was actually trained in psychoanalytic theory, and he was an analyst himself for a period of the time in his early clinical work, but he realized that that it was such a lengthy process, and he thought that a lot of the steps in psychoanalysis weren't necessarily necessary. And so, for example, it's not necessary from his perspective to explore childhood experiences and unconscious material, and that this wasn't producing change quickly enough, and that there was other strategies that could be used. And so in the 1950s, Ellis kind of reached his breaking point, so to speak, and he wanted to take a more active and practical, efficient way to helping people with their distresses. And so this really led him to developing rational emotive behavioral therapy, which was at first just called rational emotive therapy and was later coined rational emotive behavioral therapy. But this approach really emphasizes cognitions and emotions and behaviors as kind of in the name, right? Rather than, looking at past childhood experiences and waiting for the client to gain insights on their own over a long period of time. And so that was what his main focus was on, is on one's thought process and one's beliefs about events that occurred. Okay, so now that we've looked at Ellis's early development, let's define what irrational emotive behavioral therapy actually is. And so REBT is fundamentally known as an action-oriented therapeutic approach. And unlike more, passive and exploratory methods, REBT focuses on helping clients dispute irrational beliefs. And so the goal here is not to understand necessarily where those beliefs came from and their origins and look at, family of origin issues, but to just be able to identify those thoughts and replace them with more rational and helpful alternatives. So here we're focusing on the what we're going to do, not the why, right? Not the why the thoughts are there, but what are we going to do with those thoughts? And so REBT was formally established in the 1960s, as I think I mentioned actually in the previous slide, by Ellis. And at its core, it's a very like simple strategy, but it can be really powerful, right? For people to recognize their thinking patterns and kind of the unrealistic demands that sometimes people place on themselves, which we'll talk about in other slides more in depth. But he really believed that that was the core of pathology, right? Is just these illogical, irrational thinking patterns that we have. Okay, now let's look at some of the themes of REBT. So, and let's kind of unpack these one by one. So the first foundational theme is irrational beliefs. And so Ellis really argued that emotional distress isn't caused by events themselves, but by our response to those events, which often includes illogical, rigid, absolute thinking, which he called irrational beliefs. And these include things like musts and shoulds and has tos. So these are, really kind of black and white thinking of like someone must do this or this, life should be fair. Everyone must treat me right. My employees have to come to work on time, right? And so this is really kind of irrational though, because it's, people are sometimes gonna arrive to work late. That's very rigid to think every single, like say you have 100 employees, every single one of them is gonna get to work on time. There's going to be some instances where they're not going to be on time, or there's going to be some instances where you're not going to be treated fair. And so if you have these irrational beliefs that things they must occur this certain way, then you're probably going to be set up for lots of disappointment, right? And psychological suffering. And so the second theme that we're talking about is belief primacy. And so this is the idea that events do not directly cause feelings. Instead, it's our interpretation of the underlying belief system that creates our emotional response. So, for example, two people can experience the same disappointment and have entirely different beliefs. And so REBT is going to focus on the interpretations of those events, right? So, for example, in a case vignette I gave you guys a few weeks ago, right, we talked about a client who she had called her boyfriend and he didn't answer. And this upset her. And then she became anxious and she started thinking, is he cheating on me? Is he mad at me? Like, what is going on? Like her mind immediately went to all of these kind of negative beliefs, right? But if we had another person who was thinking, because she's kind of thinking illogically, right? She's not thinking rationally. She's not thinking about other alternatives. And so if she was thinking more rationally, like maybe we have someone who's in the same circumstance, they might think, oh, well, maybe he's taking a nap. Maybe his phone's on silent. Maybe he lost his phone. Like there's so many alternative, perspectives that could be going on. But someone with kind of who's thinking irrationally, and they are, going to be more likely to have that psychological suffering attached to their experience, right? So there's, like I said, there could be two people experiencing the same event. So it's not the event, because one person could call their boyfriend and he don't answer, and they, oh, okay, maybe he's doing this. And the other person calls their boyfriend and, oh my gosh, this and this and that. And they, their mind starts going crazy. And so it's not necessarily the event from the REBT perspective, but it's um the belief tied to that event. And so like if that was my client, then I would want to know, so what is the underlying thoughts there? So if he's not answering, well, then that means that he's cheating on me. Okay. And if he's not cheating on me, what does that mean? What is the underlying belief there? Well, I'm not good enough. Right. And so that's kind of where we would want to go there is what are the beliefs kind of attached to these thoughts? Right. And and so that's where we would be really focused on is the thoughts and beliefs. And then finally, REBT also is an active approach, which is important to note. It's therapists are usually very direct and logical and kind of highly engaged, right? So this is very, different from the approach. We talked about psychoanalysis in previous weeks and the idea of free association and the client just coming in and kind of saying whatever's on their mind, and them kind of leading the session. And this is not the case here with this model, right? With this model, the therapist is very direct. They're leading the session. They're asking the client, hey, what are your thoughts? What are your beliefs? Okay, let's work on changing them. There's a specific um, directive route that's being taken there, and the therapist is guiding that and the driver in that route. Okay, so all righty. So now let's look at some more examples of irrational beliefs. Okay, so one common one is a perfectionist demand. And then so this is the idea. A lot of times, people will be very critical and kind of hard on themselves and they want to be the best and they want to be perfect and they want to do well in everything that they do. And, sometimes this can serve people well, but sometimes it doesn't, right? Because it creates this kind of all or nothing um thought process, right? And one's like entire worth is then like kind of defined by their performance. And so it doesn't really leave a lot of room for mistake because if someone does not do everything perfect, then what? Right? Then there's anxiety, depression, shame, burnout. Because how hard is it for you to be perfect all the time? That's a lot of stress and work, right? So, there's a lot of, negative outcomes that can come from having, this perfectionistic demand. And it's really not rational, right? As we go back to the irrational beliefs, it's not rational for someone to think that they can be perfect all the time. This is unachievable, right? And so at some point, you're going to be disappointed. So, it's something more, a more rational belief might be, I'm going to do my best. But even if I don't perform flawlessly and perfectly, and even if I make a mistake, that doesn't define my worth, right? It's not tied to my worth. And that's what we're getting at is that belief, right? If I'm not perfect, then what, right? We want to identify these irrational beliefs. So then the second one example we'll look at is approval seeking. This is another common one. So someone might say, everyone must like me and approve of me all the times, right? I have a couple clients I've had over the years, right? Where, they call themselves people pleasers. I just always want to be loved. I want to be accepted. I'm always seeking approval from people. But this is another one that's not really realistic. So Ellis would call this kind of a rational thought, right? And so, it's not realistic that you're going to be everybody's cup of tea all of the time. And so he argued that, Ellis argued this isn't really healthy. And it's not really, rational or logical. There's going to be some people who don't like me, and that's okay. You know, I like me, and that's what really matters. That might be a more healthier belief to carry with you, right? Okay, So now let's talk about the next one, which is the fairness demand, which this is also very common. So this might sound like someone saying, life is really um, unfair and life should be fair. And why do, bad things never happen why do good things never happen to good people and things like that, right? And so, um, as much as we would like things to be fair all the time, in reality, they're not always fair. And so if we expect fairness all the time, then that's irrational. We're going to be disappointed sometimes. So a healthier, less kind of rigid, um, belief might be, I wish things were fair, but I know that they're not, but uh I'm still maybe gonna do, just because someone else is, maybe treating somebody else unfairly, I'm not gonna treat somebody unfairly, right? And, you know, um, things like that, things that are more rational and more logical and that allow us to operate, still according to, justice and our beliefs, but that are more rationally gonna, more obtainable, right? So, um, at the bottom, you can see, some key features that are often included in irrational belief. So this is, very, like I said, rigid thinking, like one must and one should. These are like absolute demands that we often have that are just not very realistic, right, for day-to-day life. And so we want to learn to be a little bit more flexible with our thinking. Okay, so now we understand, what irrational beliefs are, but how do we change them? How do we um do that? So in therapy, we would call this, from an REBT perspective, disputation. Disputing irrational beliefs would be very common in this model. And so there's a couple different types of disputation. So let's go over them. So first we have logical disputation. And so here is where, let's say, for example, a client might have, that perfectionist issue where they just want to be right all the time. And so we need to teach them to think more logically, like, hey, that's not really possible, right? And so we might ask them to, change their thoughts to say, I would prefer fill in the blank. But if that doesn't happen, it's okay, right? I would prefer for my team to win the Super Bowl or the World Series or whatever it is. But you know what? If that doesn't happen, that's okay. I'm going to go out. I'm going to play the best game of ball I could play. And it doesn't define me and my worth, right? I would love it if it happened. You see how that's more flexible? So then we have empirical disputation. And so this one focuses more on evidence. What is the evidence for this irrational belief, right? Let's examine that. Where is the proof? And so um if someone says to themselves, for instance, I'm worthless. I made this mistake and now I'm just worthless. And so we ask them to kind of examine the evidence to this irrational thought, because more often than not, it's black and white thinking. And so there's no kind of gray or middle ground. So more often than not, that thinking, there's not evidence to support a lot of times people's very exaggerated thoughts. And so as a therapist, you would want to help clients, challenge those thoughts, right? Um, see, I'm trying to think of an example. So like, let's say, my client, I had a client who was in foster care and they felt like they were unlovable. And we really worked to challenge that, right? So we said, let's look at the evidence, because I know a lot of people who love you, right? I know that your foster parents love you, your auntie and uncle love you, your grandpa and grandma love you, your friends love you, Jesus loves you, right? There's so many people who love you, right? So there's so much, supporting evidence that show that, hey, like this thought is not wrong, right? You are lovable. Look at all these people who love you. Right. So that's what we would want to do in this technique, right? In empirical disputation. And then we have functional disputation. And so this approach looks at the usefulness of the belief. So, is this belief helping you or is it hurting you? Is it improving your life or is it making your life more complicated or miserable? And so that's what we want to take a look at. And we want clients to kind of be able to identify, like, hey, and pay attention to, like, hey, is this belief serving me? And if not, what can I do about it? So for example, sometimes I tell my clients, it's hard to know. Sometimes you're not going to know the answer all the time. So if that is the case, why don't you let's work on replacing our thoughts with something that's going to be, beneficial and helpful to you versus something that's going to be, unhealthy for you. Like, for example, let's look at the vignette I gave you guys a couple weeks ago, right? And the girl who um was like, oh my goodness, he didn't answer, he's cheating on me, or he doesn't love me, or he's mad at me, all of these negative reasons why her boyfriend didn't respond to her text, right? Now, she has absolutely zero evidence to support that any of those negative conclusions, right? There's no evidence there. So even if you don't know, right, what is the healthier uh thought process and belief to undertake in that moment? So in that moment, the most healthy belief would be maybe something like, what are the alternatives? Maybe it could be sleeping. And that thought is not going to cause anxiety to lift, depression, all of these things, right? So in the case of where you're not sure of what the answer is, it might be helpful just to take on the more helpful um, belief, right? So that would be what that strategy would look like. And altogether, we can see how people are within this approach learning to be more flexible and think more rational and logical in their day-to-day lives and their self-talk. Okay, so now this is really nice. I like this. This is so REBT Ellis developed the ABC model, and this is a really helpful tool to explain the theory. And so let's kind of break it down. So um he decided that A stands for activating event. And so this is the situation or trigger that occurs, and it can be something external, like being criticized at work, or something internal, like a memory or a physical sensation. And so this is the activating event. This is what actually happened. I think in a previous lecture I referred to it as kind of like, the facts, what happened, this happened, right? And then B is the belief. Now, what did you tie to that event that happened? What is the thoughts and the beliefs behind that event? So this is the client's kind of interpretation or evaluation of that event. And remember in previous slides, we discussed how it can vary from person to person, right? And so someone who's thinking more irrationally is going to be more likely to be, to experience negative outcomes like depression and anxiety and things like that. And so the B stands for the belief, right? So this idea, right? I must be perfect, and if I'm not perfect, then I'm not lovable. I had a client once that she had an eating disorder. And so we really, talked about her eating disorder. And she told me, yeah, well, eventually it came out that her mother told her, if you're not skinny and thin and beautiful, people are not going to love you. And that's why you have to go to the gym and you have to maintain your figure and have a really strict diet. And so that was her belief system, right? Like, hey, if I'm not thin, then people aren't going to love me, then I'm unlovable, right? So in therapy, we had to work on, changing that belief system that she had. Um, and so then let's talk about consequences. So C stands for consequences. So these are the emotional and behavioral outcomes that follow that belief. So now as a result of that belief, what occurs now? What is the feelings that are kind of occurred because of it? So like, for example, if my client is telling themselves, I'm unlovable, no one's going to love me if I gain weight, and then they gain a pound and then they're, losing their mind, right? That, and then they have anxiety and depression and all of these negative experiences, right? That's that outcome of that belief, right? And so from this model, right, in order to change that consequence, right, in order to change C, we need to change B. There's a big emphasis on the connection here between B and C. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about, some core kind of techniques that a therapist might use in this model. So one of the first techniques we can talk about is Socratic questioning. And so this can involve things like probing questions to help clients uncover that, faulty, irrational thinking. So, instead of telling clients, what to believe, you can kind of ask them questions. So like, is thinking like that, serving you, or things like that, or what might be an alternative, like if you're questioning the evidence, right? What might be an alternative thought that you could have in this situation, or belief, that maybe he's asleep, right? Like the from the vignette of the girl who texts her boyfriend, right? So you're asking in this model, lots of questions. And the objective of these questions is to uncover that faulty, irrational thinking. Okay, so now let's talk about rational emotive imagery. And so this technique involves mentally rehearsing a situation that produces distress typically. And so by kind of practicing how you would respond to the event and kind of imagining it, this helps you in real time, kind of when the event actually occurs, to have a more healthier response. Right? So like if we had a maybe client who was struggling with social anxiety, we might have them, visualize, hey, what is it like to walk in that crowded classroom, and give that presentation? And then, what could you tell yourself right now in this moment, and kind of rehearse that. And then so that in real time, when that occurs, they know, exactly what to do, and they can go back to doing those whatever exercises therapists did with them. Okay, so now let's talk about shame attacking exercise. This is a really interesting concept that's very unique to REBT specifically. And so shame attacking exercises involve engaging sometimes in mildly embarrassing acts to kind of reduce fear, right? So Ellis emphasizes that really shame attacking exercises can help clients intentionally engage in these activities with the purpose of, reducing the power of kind of shame and social anxiety and things like that, and kind of weakening the need for approval from others, or embarrassment, or things like that. So for example, if I have a client who maybe has some struggle with some social anxiety, here what I might have them do under this technique is I might say, hey, why don't you go out, and I'm going to encourage you tomorrow to go talk to 5 complete strangers and have a conversation with them on purpose, right? And so what this can do is that the client is gonna maybe actually realize, hey, that wasn't so bad after all. It was a little bit uncomfortable, it was a little bit embarrassing at first, but it was actually helpful because I got to see that, more people were maybe friendly than I thought they were going to be. Or like maybe I went and talked to 5 people and, 2 people really didn't pay me much mind and ignored me. But the other 3 people I engaged in these really meaningful conversations with that I probably wouldn't have engaged with otherwise. So I got to have this experience and there was actually some positivity that came out of it. And, maybe I realized, you know what? I don't need everybody's approval. That's okay. And not having everybody's approval isn't actually, so bad, or not having everybody like me or want to talk to me, isn't the end of the world, right? You start to recognize that and like, hey, by just secluding myself from everybody, I'm missing out on opportunities of meeting and making genuine connections and relationships with people. Like, hey, yeah, 2 people totally blew me off, but 3 people I engaged in really nice conversations with and I made friends. And so that's what that would be, just, engaging in those activities to hopefully, reduce fear and anxiety and things like that. And then finally, in this technique, we have a lot of homework assignments. So we want to do lots of real world applications of, practicing using these new beliefs. And so a lot of times we'll see, because we want the client from this model not to just be practicing disputing those thoughts in session. We want them to be practicing doing that all the time, right? At home, everywhere. And so sometimes to get started with this model, therapists will have kind of like pre-formulated worksheets with like maybe before we discuss the ABC, right? They might have the ABC in it, and they might like in a pre-formulated worksheet, and then the client might fill out, okay, what is activating the event? Okay, what is the belief? Okay, what is the consequence? Okay, and they will fill it out and then they'll bring it in session. Or sometimes clients are less my therapist sorry are less structured, and they'll just tell their clients, just go and I want you to journal, and then bring your journal in, and then the client will kind of go over the journaling in the next session, and then the therapist and the client can kind of work together collaboratively to identify, okay, now we've read that journal entry. What was the activating event? What was the belief? What was the consequence? And they might even have like a whiteboard where they're kind of writing it down, like they're putting A, B, C. The person is sharing their journal entry. And then they're learning, though, how to do this. Okay, so now when you go home, you see how we did this in the chalkboard or whatever whiteboard, whatever they have. I want you to do this at home. I want you to pay attention. Hey, what is the activating event? What happened? And what is my belief about the event? And what is the consequence? And what is my feeling? And all of these things they'll have to kind of write out. And so that would be the homework strategy. Okay, now let's talk about another contributor for cognitive behavioral therapy. And this person goes by the name of Aaron Beck. So he is the founder of, first he called it cognitive therapy, CT, and then he eventually changed the name to, similar to Ellis, he added behavioral in the name. So it's cognitive behavioral therapy. And so similar, there's a lot of similarities between Beck and Ellis. And so similar to Ellis, right? His roots were in psychoanalysis, and he was trained in Freudian principles as well. And but similarly, he really noticed that, hey, I think there's a better way. There's a better way to do this. And so at first he did believe that depression stemmed from unconscious conflicts, but then later on he started doing some empirical research, particularly on depression. Back to lots of work on depression, And he designed the depression and a depression inventory, which is very useful. If we were meeting this week, I would probably have the printouts of those and maybe have you guys take a look at them, but you can just Google it if you want. Like I would have you guys actually administer those depression inventories to each other. And they'll have like, it's like a survey, and they'll have a Likert scale and all of these questions. So he did lots of kind of research and training in depression. I don't want to stem too far off though. So, but what he realized, one of the things he realized when he was doing this research is that hey, this psychoanalytic training that I've had isn't really as helpful as I thought it would be, exploring unconscious conflict. And so that's when he really turned towards cognitive behavioral therapy and looking at the cognitions, right? The thoughts and how they influence pathology. Okay, and so Beck. Beck really shifted towards CBT and looking at automatic thoughts, which he called them automatic thoughts. So you'll see the language between the two is very, very different, right? So Ellis, in his theory, he uses the term irrational thoughts, right? And Beck tends to use different terms, right? So here we're talking automatic thoughts. He discovered that automatic thoughts, which are really quick, reflective thoughts that are pessimistic, they kind of automatically, you don't even realize that you're having these thoughts, and they just occur, automatically, so quickly. And these are what is really from his perspective, right? Are really influencing negative pathologies. And so he recognized that thoughts shape emotions and they have an influence on emotions. And he thought that, exploring unconscious drives and conflicts wasn't necessary, that you could just change the thoughts and then the emotions would also change. And so he then developed his more structured, measurable therapeutic approach called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, so now let's kind of break it down. What is CBT? Okay, so what CBT does in a nutshell is it addresses dysfunctional thinking patterns. Aaron Beck developed this model in the 1960s, which is a little bit after Ellis came with his model of REBT. And at its core, CBT focuses on identifying and modifying maladaptive thought patterns and the behaviors that stem from them. And so, like I said, the central idea here is that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all interconnected, and they influence how we think and behave. Our thoughts influence, our beliefs and how we behave, all of those things. And so one of the strengths of CBT is Beck did lots of research, as I've mentioned, particularly on depression. And so this model is very evidence-based, which is a very nice strength of the model. And it's been proven to be effective in treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, and OCD, just to kind of name a few. And so the development of CBT occurred kind of spontaneous. Well, the idea is that automatic thoughts are spontaneous, and they often arrive in response to situations that trigger emotional reactions. And so that is one of the core ideas behind this model. And then we also next can take a look at cognitive distortions. And so these are systemic errors in thinking that distort reality and maintain emotional distress. And we'll talk about some specific examples of that in the next few slides. Um, then we have schemas and core beliefs. And so these go deeper than automatic thoughts. These are long standing frameworks that are formed by early experiences that shape how individuals interpret events. So this might be like I was talking about earlier, my kiddo in foster care, right? Who has, this schema and core belief that they're unlovable, right? And people are going to hurt me and the world is unsafe. So this isn't just like an automatic negative thought, like, my boss um, hates me and I'm getting fired, and there's no history behind that thought, maybe, or just an automatic thought that you might have. This is deeply rooted in your past, um it's a long-term schema that, last time people have been carrying this schema for years and years. I'm unlovable. They've been carrying it since, they were a child, and now they're an adult. That would be a schema or core belief. Then we also have, he contributed the cognitive triad. And so he really felt this was central to understanding depression. And he found in his work that depressed individuals commonly held negative views in three connected areas. So one is the self, the other is the world, and finally, the last one is the future. So like, what does that look like? So like an a cognitive distortion about the self might be like, I'm inadequate, right? It's referring to the self, right? And then a cognitive distortion about the world might be like, nothing ever works out for me. The world is against me. People are against me. And then a cognitive distortion about the future might be like, things are never going to improve. My life is always going to be this way, and things are never going to get better. And so he categorized them in three different areas. And if you guys look at the depression inventory that he developed, you'll see that a lot of the questions are related to this area. He's assessing like, okay, what cognitive distortions do we have? Are they about the self? Are they about the world? Are they about the future? So that's really kind of nice to see that. And it's it's an excellent tool to use with clients as well. So let's think about this for a second. Let's give an example of how that would look like clinically. So like, let's say a college student is struggling academically. So they might have a cognitive distortion about the self. And they might say, I just can't handle school. I'm just not smart enough. You see how the eyes there? That's about the self, right? I'm just not smart enough. And then let's say they have a cognitive distortion about the world. It's just nobody cares about me. My professors doesn't care about me. The educational system doesn't care about me. Nobody cares about me and supports me and wants me to succeed. That would be a negative thought about the world. And then a negative thought about the future. Let's say they say, I'm probably just going to fail next semester, and I'm never going to graduate, and I'm never going to get a job. You see how now those negative thoughts are tied towards the future. And all of these kind of you see how they can all impact somebody's mood, right? If you're having these thoughts, it's going to greatly impact your mood, and it can cause depression and kind of deepen hopelessness. And so in CBT, what we would want to do is we would want to be identifying, these automatic thoughts and these schemas and core beliefs and distortions, and really changing them, right? So that we can change our mood. Okay, and so from Beck's cognitive model, he's really focusing here on three things, kind of in a nutshell. We can see, and so let's break down each component. So first, he's focusing on thoughts, right, which are often automatic interpretations or evaluations that sometimes occur, and we're not even consciously aware of our thoughts all the time, right? Um, and then next, we're focusing on emotions, right? So, what are the emotions that are generated by these cognitive thoughts that we're having? Um, and, how are we interpreting, these thoughts, and how is that impacting our emotions? We're looking at that very deeply here in this model. And then finally, we also want to look at behaviors, right? And so, how are our thoughts and emotions impacting our behaviors, right? So, obviously, if you're feeling kind of depressed, it might be hard to get up out of bed in the morning, right? So, if you're having these thoughts that I'm worthless and I'm not going to succeed in anything and I'm not doing good at school, and it's because I'm not smart enough, and it's because my teachers in the educational system doesn't care about me, and I'm just going to be a failure and amount to nothing. It's going to be really hard for you to behave, accordingly as well. You're not going to want to get up in the morning and go to school. You're going to feel maybe hopeless and depressed. And that hopelessness is going to impact your behavior. So you kind of see what I want you to do is see the connection here, right? From this perspective. It's the thought. So the thought is, maybe I am I'm not smart enough and I'll never be enough. And then the emotion is maybe depression. And then the behavior now is I don't want to get up in the morning. I don't want to go to school anymore. Um, I'm going to be a failure anyway. So what's the point? You see how each one impacts the other, right? Your thoughts impact your emotions, and your emotions impact your behavior. Okay, and so now let's talk about some specific cognitive distortions, which I said that we would mention in a later slide. So now here we are. So this slide introduces really some of the most common distortions. That is really, I think, a good tool that Beck identified in his model. Is he really did a good job of categorizing different types of cognitive distortions. And so let's take look at a few examples. So one is catastrophizing. And so this is the idea of kind of expecting the worst possible outcome to occur, even if it doesn't isn't necessarily factual that that is going to be the case. So for example, I had a client who she didn't get the classes she wanted, and because it was full, and so she tried to get added on. I guess there's a period where, like, if the first 2 weeks at her college, if students don't show or they drop, you can add on. And so she was really hoping that she could add on, and then she didn't was not able to add on, and so she was crying, and she was um devastated. And so she went on to kind of catastrophize the worst possible outcome of that situation. She was like, well, I didn't get the class, and so that means I'm not taking enough classes for my scholarship. Now I'm going to lose my scholarship, and then now that means that I'm not going to graduate because I'm not going to be able to afford to pay my classes. And, all of these. And then if I don't graduate, I'm not going to be able to get a job. And then if I don't get a job, I'm going to be homeless. You see how you're just catastrophizing. She just catastrophized this situation. The situation was not great, okay, admittedly, but she took it on another level, right? She just catastrophized the whole situation to be the worst possible outcome that could happen, right? And so I'm like, okay, well, let's see what we can do here, right? Let's make an appointment with our guidance counselor. Let's talk over our options. And so it turned out there was options for her. She didn't lose her scholarship. She did graduate on time. She just had to take an extra class the following semester to make sure she graduated on time. But her mind immediately just went to, right, catastrophizing and thinking of the worst possible outcome. And because she did that, right, she turned an unpleasant, nobody would say that that's a great situation to be in, but she turned an unpleasant situation into, a catastrophe. And then that really, hiked up her anxiety and her depression, right? Because she was like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my scholarship. I'm not going to graduate. And then, she got very anxious and depressed. Versus, like, say we have somebody else who the same situation occurred to, but they didn't catastrophize, right? They said, okay, I'm going to talk to my guidance counselor. Maybe there's something I can do to work it out. And they found out, okay, yes, I can work it out. Okay, great. And there was, not an increase in, anxiety and depression and things like that. So that's an example of catastrophizing. Then we have overgeneralization. And so this is what happens when people make broad conclusions based on a single event or an isolated experience. So let's say that we have a client who doesn't perform well on one of their presentations at school. And so then they tell themselves, I'm just a failure. I fail at everything I do. I'm always going to be a failure. And thoughts like this. And so that's an overgeneralization. Maybe they didn't do well in that specific assignment, but they've done well in other assignments or in other classes. They have maybe 4.0, right? And this is just the one class that maybe they struggled in, right? And so we can see that's an overgeneralization for them to say that. And then we can also see that, we could, if we were in session with that client, we would want to challenge those thoughts and look at exploring the evidence here. Wait a minute, didn't you tell me you had a 4.0? Don't you have an A in all the other 4 classes that you're taking? So how would somebody who's, not smart and not enough do all of that, right? So we would want to challenge that distortion of overgeneralization that way. Then we have black and white thinking. And so this is really dichotomous, all or nothing thinking. Like, so either I'm perfect or I'm a failure. There's no in between, right? It's just all or nothing. And that's not really, realistic, right? And so, let's say, let's go back to that client, right? They're having really these rigid thoughts, right? I'm not enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not this enough because of one, grade on one assignment. And so we know, hey, wait a minute, that's not necessarily true. Didn't you, like I said, pass all of these other classes, but you're just thinking it's either all or nothing here. Either I'm the best or I'm a loser. Like, wait a minute, where is the in between? And is it okay to say, like, hey, you know what? I didn't do good in this class, but I did good in all my other classes. And I will continue to work hard and do good and bring my grade up and pass this course and graduate and get a job in my career field, right? And then that kind of thinking would help kind of decrease the depression and anxiety. Then we have mental filtering. And so this occurs when somebody focuses exclusively on negative aspects of the situation and ignores anything that could be positive or neutral. So let's say that, a student receives feedback on an assignment and they receive, some critical feedback, but they receive positive feedback as well. But all they see is it's like tunnel vision. All they see, they're like filtering and they're just looking at the negative comments, right? And that's all they see and that's all they're looking at. They're ignoring everything else. Well, yeah, if you're just honing in on any critical comments and you're not looking at all the positive feedback that you got, you're probably not going to feel too good. But if we're not, filtering out all of the negative details and you are able to see, the positive feedback you got, you may not have such a strong emotional response, right? So sometimes people do that. And so again, we can see, right, from how, thoughts can sometimes be distorted and how changing thoughts can change emotions and behaviors. Okay, So, some of the techniques that are embraced in cognitive behavioral therapy, which techniques is just kind of fancy word for strategies that help the clients identify their unhelpful thinking patterns and kind of build new skills that are going to create behavioral changes and hopefully, decrease things like depression and anxiety. So let's go through some of these techniques really quickly here. So one of them is cognitive restructuring. And so this is the idea that we need to change those unhelpful thoughts. And so that's what we would do in therapy. We would help the clients create more balanced and realistic alternatives to their thoughts. And that's when I said, remember, sometimes we might use like the whiteboard and then have them like say, bring in their worksheet or their journal and identify them and then kind of ask them, okay, what would be a more healthier alternative here to think than this thought right here? And then we would write those out. And so that's the cognitive restructuring, challenging those thought patterns. And then we have behavioral activation. And so this is the idea that when people feel depressed, they sometimes they withdraw from activities that usually can bring them joy and meaning. And so we want to have them activate those behaviors again to hopefully gradually improve their mood and motivation and maybe restore a sense of accomplishment. So like let's say that I know I start off really, really very small with my clients. So I'll say like things like, okay, how about you make your bed tomorrow, right? Take a shower tomorrow. Because like when someone is depressed, sometimes the smallest tasks are so challenging to do, right? But they'll tell me, when they come back, yeah, I felt really good. I was like clean, my house was clean, and then I felt accomplished and I felt better. I felt like, yes, and then I felt like, okay, I'm gonna make today a great day. I just felt better. Or like, have even yourself, you can probably acknowledge behavioral activation where sometimes you probably just do not want to go to the gym. Maybe you're just like, oh, I'm so tired. I'm dreading going to the gym. But what happens when you get there? When you get there and you start, running on the treadmill or doing whatever workout you're doing, you feel good, right? You feel accomplished and you leave the gym and you're like having all this energy and you're feeling good and accomplished. So that is what occurs with behavioral activation, right? We engage in these valued activities and then we realize, oh, okay, yeah, we start to feel better. Um, so that could be one of them. Another one is, like let's say somebody's been socially distancing themselves. They're just like, I'm depressed. They're just, staying home and wallowing in their misery. And then we say, maybe their therapist says, for your homework, I'm going to say, I know your friends have been inviting you out. How about you go out? And it's going to be kind of the same thing as the gym, right? At first you're like, I don't go. But then you get there and you're like, oh, I actually had fun. I actually enjoyed this. Wow. So that would be behavioral activation. And then we have exposure therapy. And so this is the gradual confrontation of feared stimuli. So this is the idea that, if we can expose someone to their fears and they could realize like, hey, this actually isn't, dangerous and something I need to be afraid of, and they could have a more positive experience, then gradually, that anxiety would also decrease. Okay, so now let's talk about a few additional strategies. So one of them is thought records. I already mentioned that. And when we talked about, I think, REBT, so CBT also focuses on that as well. Like this is really big in any cognitive behavioral therapy approach. We want to identify those thoughts. And so one of the best ways to do that is to keep, journals or have your therapist might give worksheets that have, things like A, B, C, or, you know, um, thoughts and mood. You're going to be looking at all of those things and having them identify them. And then we have, behavioral experiments. So, we talked about that in a previous slide as well, right? Like, having, say, the client who has social anxiety, hey, tomorrow I want you to go out and I want you to talk to 3 random strangers. And then I want you to come back and let's talk about how that felt like for you. And so this would be, them being able to actually challenge those thoughts with real world, testing. Um, and then we have active scheduling. And so this is the idea of, intentionally scheduling pleasurable activities into your weekly routine, right? And breaking these, cycles of avoidance or inactivity. So like I talked about this already, right? Like, so if your friends have been calling you and you've been ignoring them, like we're going to actively, I want you to call them and schedule, an activity that you usually enjoy to do with them. And so that's another strategy. And then coping skills training. So we might use things like relaxation techniques, emotion regulation methods, things like that to help us handle those difficult emotions when they arise, right? So because what's going to happen is you're going to get the client is going to get better at identifying their thoughts and checking in and seeing like, hey, what kind of thoughts am I having here right now? And they're going to get pretty quickly that, oh, hey, thoughts are tied to emotions, which are tied to behaviors. But then we also sometimes need to teach them coping skills training, like relaxation techniques, because those thoughts are going to come up. And even though we want them to challenge them and change them, it still could be a very difficult process. So especially like when it comes to, maybe trauma and PTSD and things like that. So we really need to couple that with emotion regulation techniques like deep breathing and mindfulness and things like that to help kind of relax them when their anxiety goes up and then give them the opportunity to think a little bit more rationally. Okay, so now that we've talked about both cognitive behavioral theories from Beck and Ellis, let's talk about some of the similarities because I think you'll already notice there's a lot of similarities between both of the models. So, they both come to similar conclusions, even though they had their separate clinical observations. So, like Beck, he spent a lot of time doing actual, research with depressed patients. So, and that's how he came to the idea like, hey, thoughts, I think thoughts are influencing this depression, right? And Alice, for him, he talks about like, needing to be more direct with clients and that change doesn't need to occur over, this drastic long period of time that, you just need to help that we don't need to explore, always the origin of the issue and the why, right? We just need to help clients know what to do when this happens. So while their stories are different, right, they do have some similarities in, their approaches that cognitions, right, are, the main drivers of pathology. Then we have the conscious focus thought. So as I mentioned, both of them were Freudian um therapists at first, they both of them ended up turning to CBT, but initially their roots were in psychoanalysis. And then they both revolutionary to the paradigm shift of, at the time, this when CBT was emerging, it wasn't, psychoanalysis was more popular at the time. So this really revolutionized psychotherapy. Okay, so now let's kind of compare and contrast and do like a quick overview. So here, Aaron Beck's CBT was established in the 1960s, which is a little bit after Albert Ellis's REBT, which was established in the 1950s. Um, the focus is, while similar, a little bit different. As far as Beck is concerned, he focuses on restructuring maladaptive thoughts. So you can see the terms here are a little bit different. And Ellis focuses on disputing irrational beliefs with logic. And so Beck's approach is more collaborative and more of a systemic assessment, while Ellis's approach is kind of a little bit more direct and confrontational. And if you have a chance, I would strongly recommend, especially, well, if you're a psychology major, I would strongly recommend that you look into, because Albert Ellis has some great videos on YouTube, particularly of a client named Gloria. If you type in YouTube, Albert Ellis session with Gloria, that session will pop up and you will be able to watch it and actually kind of see what I'm talking about when I say he's a little bit more direct and confrontational, especially in comparison to Aaron Beck. So they had different styles. So even though they shared kind of um the same idea of, that cognitions are responsible for pathologies, and in order to change, to help create change, we need to change the cognitions. They had a different therapeutic style and approach. So Ellis was more direct and confrontational. So, he would say things like, you're thinking irrational. He would just tell the client, just boldly and straightforwardly, you're not thinking rationally, you're thinking irrationally. um Beck is more collaborative and systemic. Like I said, he has developed the Beck Depression Inventory, the BDI, which is very famous. um and so in there he's kind of asking lots of questions to figure out, okay, are these thoughts related to the self? Are they related to the world? Are they related to the future? That's where he has that cognitive triad, and he's doing lots of systemic assessments, right? And they have, like, Likert scales from, like, not at all to at all. And then so he's just asking lots of questions, and he's more collaborative in the approach. He might say, like, okay, well, what do you think a healthier thought might be here in this situation? And Ellis is more direct. He might tell you, well, a healthier thought might be fill in the blank, versus Beck, who might, ask the client to take a survey or ask the client to, come up with their own healthier thoughts. So they just had different approaches. And like I said, I encourage you to, if you have a chance and you're interested in this model, do go on YouTube and look at Albert Ellis's therapy session with Gloria. Okay, so let's do a quick kind of example of CBT, because I like to do clinical application. So, like, let's say the client is presenting to therapy and they're in distraught, they're depressed and anxious, maybe because they didn't get an A in a test, and so they've had that they're catastrophizing, and they have this all or nothing thinking, right? And so now they're having severe anxiety and panic attacks, and they're just avoiding studying. They don't want to go to school anymore or get out of bed. And so what we would do from a CBT intervention is we would want to restructure those thoughts, right? So we would want to say something like, hey, one grade is just one data point, and it doesn't define your entire future, right? You can still succeed. See, so we want to restructure those thoughts so they're not so black and white. I'm either perfect or I'm a failure. Like, whoa, right? That's really black and white. And we want to help them not to catastrophize, to, like, I got an A, I didn't get an A and now my life is over. I'm never going to get a job, right? That's like, well, that's very, you're catastrophizing here. So is there any other way that we could, view this situation here, and change our thought process there? And then, maybe we want to do, a behavioral experiment and have them, take the test again, and then see that they did better. And then, like, okay, see, it was just, maybe you didn't get enough rest, or maybe you didn't study enough. It doesn't mean you're a failure. And the outcome should hopefully help kind of reduce anxiety and improve their performance. Okay, now let's take a look at CBT from a Christian perspective, right? And so we talked about a lot of times clients struggle with these perfectionist idealists of themselves, right? And how that's really not realistic to achieve. And so from a Christian perspective, it's not realistic either. We know that we're fallen creatures, right? And we know that we need to be able to kind of accept that we are sinners, right? And have this grace-based acceptance approach. Um, but with that, we also know that God values us regardless of our imperfections. We're still loved by Him. So you see that belief that we talked about, right, in previous slides, that the belief that the event itself is not what causes the distress, it's the belief about the event. So not getting the A is not what causes the distress, it's the belief about the event. Now I didn't get an A, and so now I'm not enough. Now I'm not perfect, right? That's what's causing the distress. And so, from a Christian perspective, if we are, let's say, we're striving for perfection, which is not realistic, but why are we striving for perfection? Because that's what's really, from this perspective, causing the distress, right? It's the belief. And so, but as Christians, say we're doing some Christian integration and the client is Christian, we can see, like, if the belief is, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm not enough because I'm not perfect, we can see, hey, we know we're not perfect, but God loves us anyway. So we are lovable, right? So that would be a way to kind of integrate those Christian themes into work with clients, right? These themes of grace and acceptance and redemption and renewal, all of these things can be extremely helpful when working with clients and paying attention to their thought processes. Okay, so normally if we were doing this in class, I would have you guys actually team up and work in small groups, and I would give you guys vignettes and things like that. I usually do. But we're not going to do that today. So I still encourage you. I'm, as you know, I'm a really big proponent of application. I don't like just teaching things and without having you guys actually apply what you're learning to real world situations. So I strongly, strongly encourage you guys, don't just let this be a lecture that goes in and out one ear, actually apply these concepts into your life. So one way to do that could be like this week, just pay attention to your thoughts and pay attention to language. Like, do I have musts and shoulds and always and any irrational thoughts are they going along in my head, and how are they, affecting my health and my mental health, my emotions, all of these things. And then you can also practice, disputing them. What is a healthier thought I could have in this situation? What is a more logical thought? You could examine the evidence. Like, is this thought even true? Is it factual? And is it helping? And if it's not helping, what could be, more helpful? And, replacing it with a more rational, flexible alternative belief, instead of this, demanding language. So see, like a quick example, right? I must be perfect. Okay, let's change that to I prefer to do well, but I'm a human. I make mistakes, and that's okay. You see how that's less rigid? It's more flexible and accepting, and it's more realistic, right? All righty. So with that, we're all done with this lecture. So I know we're at a closing to the semester. So I just want to thank all of you guys for all of your hard work. I'm so proud of each and every one of you. And, I'm looking forward to reading those final reflection papers that I know you guys will have coming my way soon. So, very nice. You guys are almost there. So some words of encouragement. You guys got this. You're almost there. Let's finish strong. You'll get there. And, so proud of you. Bye-bye.